Commander Zekthara of the Veltar Empire stood before the War Council, his 6 arms trembling slightly as he prepared to deliver his report. The massive crystalline chamber fell silent, thousands of compound eyes focusing on him. His mandibles clicked nervously as he began to speak, his voice carrying across the vast space through neural amplifiers. Honored council members, what I am about to tell you will challenge everything we believed about warfare, about conquest, and about the species we call humans. The eldest counselor, Ancient Mordun, leaned forward on his floating throne. Speak, Commander. Your fleet was tasked with subjugating a single planet. How did you return with only 3 ships from a force of 200? Zekthara's primary eyes dimmed with the memory. We approached their world, Terra, with standard protocol. Our intelligence indicated a young species, barely 3,000 years into recorded history. They had primitive kinetic weapons, chemical propulsion, and were divided into numerous tribal territories. By all calculations, it should have been a simple harvesting operation. He paused, his respiratory spiracles fluttering rapidly. The commander activated a holographic display showing the blue-green planet. Our approach was detected at the edge of their solar system, though we believed their technology incapable of such range. What we didn't understand was that humans had been watching the stars far longer than we anticipated. They had prepared for our arrival. Ancient Mordun's voice resonated with skepticism. A primitive species prepared for the Veltar Empire? Explain this impossibility. Number. The first sign something was amiss came when we entered their orbital space. Captain Vorth's reconnaissance ship simply vanished. No distress signal. No weapons discharge detected on our sensors. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. We assumed equipment failure. Zekthara's voice grew quieter, forcing the council to lean in. The second ship disappeared 12 hours later. Then, the third. We finally understood we were under attack when Captain Relmoth's ship exploded right before our sensors. But we saw no attacking vessels, no weapons fire, nothing that made sense according to our understanding of warfare. The holographic display shifted to show tactical readouts. The humans were using what they called stealth technology and nuclear torpedoes, weapons that could travel through space undetected until impact. But this was just the beginning of their surprises. Our battle doctrine required establishing orbital superiority before ground assault. We moved our capital ships into attack formation and began bombardment of their major population centers. We expected panic, surrender, the usual pattern of conquest. Zekthara's head crest flattened against his skull, a sign of deep distress among his species. Instead, they fought back with a ferocity I had never witnessed. Every destroyed city launched retaliatory strikes. Every fallen human seemed to inspire 10 more to take up arms. They showed no fear of death, no instinct for self-preservation that we could exploit. The display showed images of burning cities and mushroom clouds. They turned their own nuclear weapons against our ground forces. Can you imagine? They were willing to irradiate their own planet to deny us victory. What manner of species chooses mutual destruction over surrender? Ancient Mordun's mandibles clicked in confusion. Surely their survival instinct would have prevailed once the futility became apparent. That is what we believed. We were wrong about their nature entirely. Zekthara's voice carried a note of grudging admiration. When our forces landed in what they called North America, we expected the standard pattern of resistance, followed by capitulation. Instead, we encountered something unprecedented. The hologram shifted to show tactical maps of Earth's continents. Their military responded with coordination that suggested a unified command structure, despite our intelligence indicating they were a fractured species with competing territorial claims. Within hours of our landing, forces from across their planet were mobilizing to converge on our positions. But it wasn't just their military that fought us. Every human civilian became a potential combatant. They had weapons hidden in their dwellings, their places of learning, even their temples of worship. Children barely old enough to walk carried explosive devices. Elders past their prime fighting years served as spotters and intelligence gatherers. Zekthara's auxiliary eyes focused on different council members as he continued. We captured one of their communication hubs and intercepted their coordination signals. What we heard defied our understanding of civilization itself. They were sharing tactical information freely between their competing nation-states. Former enemies were coordinating joint attacks against us. They had literally united their entire species against us overnight. The first major ground engagement occurred in a region they called Europe. Our shock troops, veterans of a dozen successful conquests, advanced through what their maps identified as Germany. We expected to face their organized military and defeat them in conventional battle. The commander's voice grew hollow. Instead, we found cities that had been evacuated and rigged with explosives. Every building, every bridge, every road had been turned into a trap. They had abandoned valuable territory willingly, drawing us into kill zones prepared in advance. When we reached what they called Berlin, the entire city detonated. 2 full battalions of our finest warriors were vaporized instantly. The humans had sacrificed one of their major population centers just to eliminate a fraction of our force. Ancient Mordun's head crest rose in alarm. Not just cities. They destroyed everything that might be useful to us. Their fuel deposits, their manufacturing facilities, their food production centers. They called it scorched earth tactics. They would rather see their world burn than allow us to claim it. Zekthara's voice carried a note of disbelief even as he recounted the events. But the true horror wasn't their willingness to sacrifice territory. It was their adaptability. Within days of first contact, they had analyzed our weapons, our armor, our tactics. They began producing countermeasures using their primitive industrial base. Our personal shields, which had protected us against every known weapon type, became useless when they started using what they called white phosphorus. Our atmospheric suits, designed for hostile environments, failed against their chemical weapons. Our communication equipment was jammed by technologies they invented during the battle. The holographic display showed human military installations. They learned faster than any species in our databases. Every tactic we employed, they countered within hours. Every technology we deployed, they reverse-engineered and improved upon. It was as if they were designed for warfare. The second major engagement was in their Asia region. Our intelligence suggested we could exploit historical tensions between their nations called China and Japan. We expected to face divided forces, each more concerned with their neighbors than with us. Zekthara's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. Instead, we found they had merged their military commands under something they called the Terra Defense Initiative. Former enemies were sharing resources, technology, even soldiers. They had achieved in weeks what our diplomats said was impossible for their species. The combined Asian forces employed tactics that challenged every principle in our military codex. They used their massive population as a strategic advantage, fielding armies larger than our entire invasion force. But it wasn't just numbers they used against us. The commander's primary eyes dimmed as he recalled the memory. They used deception on a scale we had never encountered. False intelligence, decoy installations, phantom armies that existed only in their electronic networks. Half our battles were fought against illusions, while their real forces attacked our supply lines. What disturbed us most was their treatment of casualties. When our warriors fell in battle, we followed standard protocol and retrieved them for honorable return to their families. When human warriors fell, they continued fighting until their bodies could no longer function. Some kept fighting even after what should have been fatal injuries. We captured one of their soldiers after a firefight in what they called Tokyo. He had lost significant blood and should have been unconscious. Instead, he kept attempting to trigger an explosive device even while sedated. When we questioned him about his willingness to die, he simply stated, "You picked the wrong planet." Ancient Mordun leaned back in his throne, processing the implications. How many engagements did your forces attempt? We established 7 different fronts across their planet. Each one followed the same pattern. Initial success followed by increasingly desperate resistance, then tactical adaptation, then strategic coordination that turned our advantages against us. Zekthara's voice grew quiet again. The engagement in their Australia region taught us that even their geographic isolation wouldn't work in our favor. Despite being surrounded by water and separated from other land masses, they maintained constant communication and coordination with forces on other continents. They had converted their entire civilian infrastructure into military support. Their entertainment networks became intelligence coordination centers. Their commercial transportation systems moved military supplies. Their educational institutions produced tactical innovations. Every human civilian had become part of their war machine. 1. The holographic display showed orbital imagery of Earth's continents. By the 4th week, we realized we weren't fighting a military force. We were fighting an entire planet that had achieved total mobilization in response to our presence. Every human, regardless of age or capability, had found a role in their resistance. Our psychological warfare specialists reported complete failure of demoralization tactics. Humans didn't respond to demonstrations of our technological superiority with submission. They responded with increased determination. Every successful attack we made seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their resolve. We intercepted their communications and learned they had terms for our situation. They called it asymmetric warfare and insurgency. They had historical precedents for this type of conflict and had studied methods for defeating technologically superior invaders. Zekthara's head crest flattened completely. Council members, they had planned for our arrival not just tactically, but philosophically. They had spent generations preparing for the possibility of invasion by a superior force. They knew they couldn't match us in technology, so they had developed doctrines to make technology irrelevant. The 5th week brought the event that convinced me our mission was hopeless. They simultaneously attacked all 7 of our main bases using coordinated nuclear strikes. They were willing to irradiate vast portions of their own planet to deny us safe harbor. HFY 17:7 Very says, but what truly horrified us was the aftermath. Within hours of the nuclear bombardment, human forces were moving through the contaminated zones, wearing protective equipment they had manufactured during the conflict. They had turned their own nuclear weapons into area denial weapons that affected us more than them. We had gained control of no territory. We had secured no resources. We had established no safe areas for consolidation. Every victory was temporary. Every advantage was soon countered. We were fighting an enemy that learned from every engagement and shared that knowledge instantly across their entire species. The council chamber fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled leaders. Finally, Ancient Mordoon spoke. You're telling us that a pre-spaceflight civilization defeated the Veltar Empire? Zekthara's response carried a weight of terrible certainty. Honored Ancient, what I'm telling you is worse than defeat. I'm telling you we never had a chance. Commander Zekthara's second testimony began the following day, his appearance noticeably more haggard than before. The War Council had spent the night in emergency session, analyzing his initial report. Now they demanded details about the escalating conflict. Council members, yesterday I described our first contact with humanity. Today I must tell you about what happened when we realized conventional conquest was impossible. His voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. We made the decision to escalate to total warfare. Ancient Mordoon gestured with his primary appendage. Explain this escalation. Commander, Admiral Korthlan, arrived with reinforcements 3 weeks into the campaign. She brought specialized siege equipment, chemical weapons, and authorization to use any means necessary to complete the mission. Zekthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. We had convinced ourselves that humans were simply more resistant than usual, not fundamentally different. The holographic display activated, showing massive war machines descending from orbit. The Admiral deployed our atmospheric processors, designed to convert their oxygen-nitrogen mixture to something more suitable for our physiology. The plan was to make their planet uninhabitable for them while creating perfect conditions for us. Within hours of activation, the humans had identified the processor's purpose and began launching coordinated attacks against them. But it wasn't their military response that troubled us most. It was how quickly their entire civilization adapted to the changing atmospheric conditions. Zekthara's respiratory spiracles fluttered with agitation. They began producing breathing apparatus for their civilian population, not just emergency equipment, but mass-produced life support systems. Their industrial capacity, which our intelligence had described as moderate, suddenly seemed infinite. We were converting their atmosphere, and they were producing millions of personal atmospheric processors daily. They had retooled their entire manufacturing base in less than a week. Every factory, every workshop, every educational facility was producing life support equipment. The commander's auxiliary eyes focused on different council members, but the most disturbing aspect was their genetic adaptation protocols. We intercepted communications, indicating they were developing biological modifications to help their species survive in the converted atmosphere. Council members, they were planning to evolve themselves rather than surrender. In real time, during an active invasion, they were researching ways to modify their own biology to counter our terraforming efforts. Ancient Mordoon's head crest rose sharply. That's impossible. Biological adaptation requires generations, not weeks. That's what we believed, until we encountered their volunteers. Humans who had submitted to experimental genetic modifications to test countermeasures against our atmospheric conversion. Zekthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They were using their own people as test subjects for survival modifications. We captured several of these modified humans during raids on their research facilities. Our bioanalysts were horrified to discover that the modifications were successful. These humans could survive in our converted atmosphere without artificial assistance. The holographic display showed complex genetic sequences. Their scientists had achieved in weeks what evolution typically requires millennia to accomplish. They were literally creating new variants of their species faster than we could adapt our strategies. Admiral Korthlan decided to deploy our viral weapons, designed to target their specific genetic markers. These weapons had never failed to eliminate resistance within days. Zekthara paused, his mandibles clicking in what might have been disbelief. The humans had anticipated this possibility. They had developed something they called distributed genetic databases. Every human carried multiple genetic samples from their species, stored in their technology devices. When our viral weapons targeted specific genetic patterns, they simply activated dormant genes that provided immunity. But the horror didn't stop there. They began modifying our viral weapons and deploying them against us. Within a week, they had turned our own biological warfare against our forces. Our soldiers began falling to diseases that shouldn't have been able to affect our species. Zekthara's voice grew hollow. They had reverse-engineered our viral weapons, modified them to target our genetic structure, and mass-produced them using their captured biosamples. They were using our own weapons against us more effectively than we had used them against them. The Admiral authorized deployment of our reality disruptors, weapons that could collapse local space-time and eliminate entire regions. These weapons had never been used against a civilian population. The first reality disruptor eliminated what they called New York City and the surrounding region. The area simply ceased to exist, along with 12 million human civilians. Zekthara's primary eyes dimmed. We expected this demonstration to break their will to resist. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The remaining humans became even more determined to fight. They began developing their own space-time manipulation technologies using the residual energy signatures from our weapons. Ancient Mordoon leaned forward sharply. They developed reality manipulation during an invasion? Not only developed it, but weaponized it. Within 2 weeks of our first use, they were deploying crude but effective space-time distortion weapons against our ships. Zekthara's voice carried notes of both fear and grudging respect. They had learned to manipulate reality itself in the time it takes most species to understand basic mathematics. We realized we were facing a species that could adapt to any threat we presented. Every escalation we attempted was matched or exceeded by their responses. We weren't fighting a military force or even a civilization. We were fighting evolution itself, compressed into real-time responses. The holographic display shifted to show Earth from orbit, scarred by weapons of unimaginable power. The Admiral made her final decision. She authorized use of the Planet Killer, a weapon designed to shatter worlds. If we couldn't conquer Earth, we would eliminate it entirely. The Planet Killer required 7 days to achieve full power. During those 7 days, something unprecedented happened. Zekthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. The humans detected our preparations and began their own planet-scale project. They were building what they called an Exodus fleet, using materials salvaged from our destroyed ships. In 7 days, they constructed spacecraft capable of carrying their entire species to other worlds. Council members, they were preparing to abandon their homeworld rather than allow us to destroy it. But they weren't planning to flee to safety. They were planning to follow us home. End. The War Council erupted in shocked vocalizations. Ancient Mordune's voice cut through the noise. They were planning to invade the Veltar Empire? Worse than that, they were planning to survive the destruction of their world and use the technology they had learned from us to spread across the galaxy. Zekthara's voice carried absolute certainty. They had studied our ships, our weapons, our technology. They understood our capabilities better than most of our own engineers. On the 6th day of the Planet Killer's charging sequence, they launched a preemptive strike against the weapon itself. Using their newly developed space-time manipulation technology, they created a temporal loop around the Planet Killer. The weapon was trapped in a bubble of recursive time, constantly charging but never reaching full power. They had neutralized our ultimate weapon, using principles they had learned by observing its operation. Zekthara's head crest flattened completely. But the most terrifying aspect was the message they sent us afterward. A simple transmission that reached every ship in our fleet simultaneously, bypassing our security protocols entirely. The holographic display showed the text of the message in human script. With Veltar, translation below. We know where you come from. We know how to find you. Leave now, or we will bring this war to your worlds. Admiral Korthland decided to call their bluff. She ordered our remaining ships to begin bombardment of their major population centers. If we couldn't use the Planet Killer, we would destroy their civilization piece by piece. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. We destroyed dozens of their cities, eliminated billions of their population, reduced vast areas of their planet to radioactive wasteland. Zekthara's voice grew quiet. It should have been the end of their resistance. Instead, it was the beginning of our nightmare. The surviving humans activated what they called the final protocol. Every human, everywhere on their planet, received the same message simultaneously, through methods we couldn't trace or jam. The message was simple. Survival Plan 7. All humans are now military personnel. Total war authorization confirmed. Bring them down with us. What followed was 48 hours of coordinated attacks against our fleet that defied every principle of military strategy. Every human, regardless of age or physical capability, participated in direct assaults against our positions. They used suicide drones piloted by children. They launched nuclear missiles guided by elderly humans willing to die in the guidance systems. They deployed chemical weapons manufactured in their schools and hospitals. Zekthara's primary eyes focused on Ancient Mordune, council member. They turned their entire planet into a weapon aimed at our fleet. Every human had become a guidance system, a targeting computer, a delivery mechanism for destruction. Our losses in those 48 hours exceeded our casualties from the previous month of fighting. We were losing ships faster than we could retreat to safe distance. On the 2nd day of their final protocol, something happened that convinced me our species was facing an existential threat. The humans began launching crude but functional spacecraft built from the wreckage of their destroyed cities. These ships were barely spaceflight capable, held together with primitive materials and desperation, but they were armed with nuclear weapons and piloted by volunteers who never intended to return home. They were conducting suicide attacks against our capital ships, using spacecraft they had built during active bombardment. The level of coordination, determination, and tactical innovation was beyond anything in our military databases. Ancient Mordune's voice carried disbelief. A planet under bombardment was launching counterattacks into space? Not just counterattacks. They were winning. Their crude ships were penetrating our defenses and eliminating our capital ships through suicide attacks. They had turned desperation into an effective naval strategy. By the end of the second day, Admiral Korthlan made the decision to retreat. We had lost 60% of our fleet to an enemy that shouldn't have been able to touch us. We were being defeated by a species that was dying as they fought us, but the retreat itself became another horror. The humans had learned to track our faster-than-light signatures. Their suicide ships followed us through hyperspace, continuing their attacks even as we tried to escape. Zekthara's voice dropped to barely audible levels. Council members, they were following us home. Commander Zekthara's final testimony began with him standing before the War Council in full ceremonial armor, bearing the scars of battle and the weight of terrible knowledge. His voice had changed over the 3 days of testimony, becoming harder, more certain, and infinitely more frightening to his audience. Honored Council, today I must tell you about our retreat from human space and the discoveries that followed. What I reveal will challenge our understanding of warfare, intelligence, and survival itself. Ancient Mordune gestured for him to proceed, though his mandibles clicked with barely concealed anxiety. The entire council had been in emergency session since the second day of testimony, and their conclusions were uniformly grim. The retreat from Earth began as a standard withdrawal under enemy pressure. Admiral Korthlan ordered all surviving ships to rendezvous at Rally Point Theta 7, 6 light-years from the human home system. Zekthara activated the holographic display, showing star charts. We assumed that once beyond their technological reach, we could reorganize and assess our losses. We were wrong about their technological reach. The first human pursuit ship arrived at Theta 7 12 hours before our slowest vessels. A crude craft that shouldn't have been capable of faster-than-light travel was waiting for us at our rally point. His voice carried notes of disbelief. Even now, they had somehow tracked our fleet movements and calculated our destination. Captain Morseth's heavy cruiser was destroyed by what appeared to be a single human pilot in a spacecraft built from salvaged materials. The pilot transmitted a message before impact. This is just the beginning. We're coming for all of you. Oh, the council erupted in shocked vocalizations before Ancient Mordune restored order. Over the following week, human ships appeared at 17 different locations throughout Veltar space. These ships were attacking supply convoys, research stations, and civilian transports. They had somehow acquired detailed intelligence about our territorial boundaries and strategic assets. Zekthara's auxiliary eyes scanned the assembled council members. But these weren't random attacks. Every target they selected had strategic value for supporting invasion fleets. They were systematically dismantling our capacity to support military operations far from home. Admiral Korthlan authorized deep intelligence analysis of the captured human vessels. What our experts discovered defied explanation. The ships contained technology that was simultaneously primitive and advanced beyond our understanding. They were using nuclear reactors for power, but contained within magnetic confinement fields that shouldn't have been possible with their materials science. They had faster-than-light drives built from scavenged components that operated on principles our physicists couldn't identify. The holographic display showed technical schematics of captured human technology. Most disturbing was their computer systems. They had created artificial intelligence networks using quantum processors built from crystalline structures that appeared to be grown rather than manufactured. These AI systems were learning and adapting in real time, sharing information instantaneously across their entire fleet, regardless of distance. Each human ship was connected to every other human ship through quantum entanglement networks. Ancient Mordoon leaned forward. They achieved instantaneous communication across interstellar distances? Not just communication. They had created a collective intelligence network that allowed every human pilot to access the knowledge and experience of every other human pilot simultaneously. Zekthara's voice carried a mixture of fear and awe. They had become a hive mind, distributed across space and time. But the most horrifying discovery came when we analyzed their biological samples. The humans we were fighting weren't entirely the same species that had inhabited Earth when we arrived. They had been modifying themselves continuously throughout the conflict. Not just to survive our weapons, but to optimize themselves for space warfare. Enhanced reflexes, improved radiation resistance, modified circulatory systems to handle extreme acceleration. Council members, they were evolving themselves into the perfect space-faring warrior species during active combat. Every engagement taught them how to become more effective killers. Zekthara paused, allowing the implications to settle. 3 weeks after beginning our retreat, we received a transmission from Earth that changed everything. The planet we had thought we had destroyed was very much alive. The holographic display showed images of Earth, scarred but rebuilding at an impossible pace. They had not only survived our bombardment but were using the radioactive materials from our weapons to fuel accelerated industrial development. The craters we had created were being converted into massive manufacturing complexes. They sent us a message that our translation protocols could barely process. It read, "Thank you for the materials and the motivation. We'll be visiting your world soon. Prepare accordingly." Admiral Korthlan realized we faced a threat unlike anything in Veltar military history. She authorized implementation of Protocol Omega, the complete evacuation of our border worlds. But the humans had anticipated this response. They began appearing in our core systems before we could complete the evacuation. Somehow, they had acquired detailed maps of our entire empire and were targeting our most valuable worlds. Ancient Mordoon's head crest rose in alarm. How could they have obtained strategic intelligence about the empire? That question led to the most terrifying discovery of all. We began investigating how they had acquired so much information so quickly. Zekthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. What we found was that they hadn't just been defending their world. They had been studying us. Every engagement, every tactical maneuver, every communication we had transmitted had been analyzed and catalogued. They had built a complete picture of our capabilities, our weaknesses, and our strategic doctrine. But more than that, they had been studying our biology, our psychology, our social structure. They understood us better than we understood ourselves. The holographic display showed complex psychological profiles. They had identified our decision-making patterns, our command hierarchy, our cultural weaknesses. They knew how we would respond to any situation before we knew ourselves. The humans hadn't just been fighting a military campaign. They had been conducting a comprehensive analysis of our entire civilization. While we were trying to conquer their world, they were learning how to conquer ours. Zekthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They had turned the invasion into an intelligence-gathering operation. Every battle, every casualty, every tactical exchange had been a learning experience for them. 4 weeks after beginning our retreat, the first human ship arrived in orbit around Veltar Prime. A single small craft carrying a single human pilot who requested permission to land and address the War Council directly. The council chamber fell completely silent. Ancient Mordoon's voice carried barely controlled terror. "A human came here?" Not just any human. The pilot identified herself as Commander Sarah Chen of the Terra Defense Force and claimed to be speaking for all of humanity. Zekthara's primary eyes focused on Ancient Mordoon. She wanted to discuss terms for our surrender. Our surrender? The Ancient's voice cracked with disbelief. She presented us with a detailed analysis of our military capabilities, our territorial holdings, our population centers, and our strategic vulnerabilities. Information that should have taken decades to gather through conventional intelligence operations. But the most disturbing aspect of her presentation was the timeline she provided. She showed us exactly how long it would take human forces to systematically conquer every world in the Veltar Empire, using the technologies they had developed. Zekthara activated a new holographic display showing invasion scenarios. According to her calculations, complete conquest of our empire would require approximately 2 years. She provided detailed tactical assessments for every major world, every defensive position, every strategic asset. When Admiral Korthlan questioned how they could possibly succeed against our full military might, Commander Chen provided a demonstration. She activated a device that projected a holographic image of Veltar Prime as seen from orbit. But this wasn't a current image. This was a tactical projection showing our world as it would appear after human conquest. Every military installation was marked for destruction. Every industrial complex was designated for conversion to human use. Every population center was categorized for either relocation or elimination. Ancient Mordoon's respiratory spiracles fluttered rapidly. They had planned the conquest of our homeworld, planned, prepared, and positioned forces to execute. Commander Chen informed us that human ships were already in position around 17 of our core worlds, waiting for orders to begin systematic destruction. But she didn't come to threaten us. She came to offer us an alternative. Zekthara's voice carried a note of weary resignation. She proposed what she called a controlled transition. Humanity would assume control of the Veltar Empire, but would preserve our species as a client state, rather than eliminating us entirely. Her terms were simple. Complete demilitarization of all Veltar forces, transfer of all strategic assets to human control, relocation of our population to designated reservation worlds, and acceptance of human oversight over all Veltar activities. In exchange, she guaranteed the survival of our species under human protection. We would be fed, housed, and allowed to maintain our cultural practices within the boundaries they established. The War Council erupted in outraged vocalizations, but Ancient Mordoon's gesture restored order. What was Admiral Korthlan's response? End quote. 2022, 2020-2012, 2020-12, 2012. The Admiral rejected the proposal and ordered Commander Chen's immediate detention. But when our security forces moved to arrest her, she simply smiled and activated another device. The device projected images of our families, our homeworlds, our civilian populations, all under observation by human forces we hadn't known were there. Zekthara's voice grew hollow. She had been transmitting real-time intelligence about our homeworld to human forces throughout our conversation. They had been watching us, learning about us, preparing to control us. Sens, one Stenser. Commander Chen explained that humanity had decided our species represented too great a threat to be allowed continued independence. Our military capabilities, combined with our aggressive expansion policies, made us a long-term danger to galactic stability. But she also explained that humanity had no interest in genocide. They preferred to transform potential enemies into useful allies through what they called constructive integration. When the Admiral continued to refuse their terms, Commander Chen provided a final demonstration. She contacted human forces positioned around our core worlds and ordered a limited strike against uninhabited areas to demonstrate their capabilities. 17 of our worlds experienced simultaneous attacks that lasted exactly 60 seconds. Military installations, communication hubs, and defensive platforms were eliminated with precision that shouldn't have been possible. Ancient Mordoon's voice was barely a whisper. Not attacked. Demonstrated. Every strike was precisely calibrated to eliminate military targets without harming civilian populations. They were showing us that they could destroy our defensive capabilities whenever they chose, but were restraining themselves. Commander Chen explained that this demonstration represented less than 1% of human military capability currently positioned throughout our empire. The remainder was being held in reserve pending our decision. Zekthara's mandibles clicked with finality. Admiral Korthlan realized that resistance was futile. We weren't facing an invasion. We were facing an occupation that had already succeeded. The Admiral asked how humanity had achieved such overwhelming superiority in such a short time. Commander Chen's response will haunt me until my death cycle ends, she said. You attacked the wrong species at the wrong time. Humanity doesn't just fight wars. We learn from them. Every conflict teaches us how to win the next one, more efficiently. You taught us how to defeat you, and now we'll use that knowledge to bring peace to the galaxy. When the Admiral asked what she meant by peace, Commander Chen explained humanity's long-term vision. They intended to prevent interstellar warfare by assuming control of all military-capable species and directing their energies toward constructive purposes. Humanity sees itself as a stabilizing force that will end the cycle of conquest and destruction that has characterized galactic history. They believe that by controlling military technology and territorial expansion, they can create permanent peace. Zekthara's primary eyes dimmed as he concluded his testimony. Council members, humanity offered us a choice between extinction and servitude. Admiral Korthlan chose servitude. The formal surrender of the Veltar Empire was signed aboard a human vessel in orbit around our homeworld. We are now a protectorate of the Terran Federation, subject to their laws and dependent on their protection. But I must tell you the most important truth of all. This wasn't a conquest. This was an intervention. Humanity had been watching the galaxy for years, identifying species that represented threats to galactic stability. We weren't their first target. We won't be their last. They have identified dozens of aggressive species that will receive the same treatment we received. Ancient Mordun's voice carried the weight of absolute defeat. What do you recommend, Commander? I recommend compliance, cooperation, and gratitude that they chose to preserve our species rather than eliminate it. Zekthara's voice carried absolute conviction. Humanity doesn't just win wars, they end them permanently. They are the apex predators of the galaxy, and we are fortunate to be allowed to exist under their protection. The age of Veltar expansion is over. The age of human guidance has begun. And perhaps, for the first time in galactic history, we might actually achieve peace. The War Council sat in stunned silence as the implications of Commander Zekthara's testimony settled over them. The Veltar Empire, conqueror of dozens of worlds, had been defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by a species that had turned warfare itself into a learning experience. Humanity had not just won a war. They had evolved into something beyond traditional military doctrine, beyond conventional understanding of conflict. They had become the ultimate adaptive species, capable of learning, evolving, and dominating any threat they encountered. And now they were coming for the rest of the galaxy, armed with the knowledge they had gained from defeating every species that dared to challenge them. The age of human dominance had begun, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it.